It was nearly midnight when the last bus of the night rolled through the empty avenues, its headlights cutting through a thin curtain of drizzle that had been falling since sunset. Ethan Carter climbed aboard after walking out of a meeting that had collapsed within 20 minutes. His tie loosened, his mind still ringing with the sound of a boardroom door closing behind him harder than necessary. The bus was almost deserted, save for a handful of tired strangers scattered across the seats. Like forgotten thoughts, nobody had bothered to finish. In the very last row, a black woman sat asleep, her head resting against the cold window, her arms wrapped tightly around an old canvas bag, as though it held the only thing left that mattered to her in the entire world. Ethan sat 2 rows ahead, watching her reflection in the glass without meaning to, the way a person watches a candle flicker, without quite noticing they have stopped blinking. There was something about the way she held that bag, something fierce and instinctive, the grip of someone who had learned the hard way that nothing in this world stays safe unless you hold it yourself. When the driver called out the final stop in a bored, mechanical voice, Ethan reached over and gently touched her shoulder to wake her before she missed her destination entirely. She startled awake, disoriented, mumbling an apology to the driver as she scrambled to her feet, her body moving faster than her mind could catch up to. In her rush, 2 folded slips of paper slipped from her bag and fluttered to the floor of the bus, landing near Ethan's polished shoes. He bent down and picked them up before she could reach them herself, an automatic gesture, the kind a stranger makes without thinking twice. They were pay stubs, one from a hospital where she worked the night shift, another from an office cleaning company where she worked before dawn each morning. He glanced at the numbers almost without thinking, and what he saw made him pause completely, his fingers suddenly still against the worn paper. Then he looked up at her hands, cracked and worn from years of scrubbing floors and lifting patients twice her size, and something in his chest tightened in a way he could not immediately explain, even to himself. That single moment, brief and unplanned, lasting no longer than the space between 2 heartbeats, would go on to change the course of both their lives forever. Ethan Carter was 42 years old, a man whose name had once been spoken in the same breath as the greatest technology founders of his generation, printed across magazine covers, and whispered about in rooms he was rarely invited into personally. He had built a company from nothing in a rented garage during his 20s, working nights on borrowed equipment, and sold it years later for a sum so large that reporters struggled to write the number without running out of space in their headlines. Wealth had come to him quickly, and with it came isolation, because the higher he climbed, the fewer people remained who wanted anything from him besides his money and the shadow of his name. He had learned, slowly and painfully, through betrayals large and small, that trust was the most expensive thing he owned, and almost no one around him seemed to want it for free. He lived in a penthouse with more rooms than memories, surrounded by art he had bought at auction but never truly looked at, furniture selected by decorators he had met only once. Most nights, he could have called for a private car, a driver waiting patiently outside any building he chose to walk into. Yet more and more often, he found himself boarding the last public bus instead, coat collar pulled up, face unremarkable in the dim light. There was something about sitting among strangers, watching ordinary lives unfold in silence around him, that made him feel less like a machine built for profit and more like a person again, however briefly. He never spoke to anyone on those rides, never offered his name or his story. He simply watched. The way a man watches a fire he no longer has the strength or the matches to build for himself. Sometimes he wondered what his old friends from the garage days would think if they saw him now, riding beside grocery store clerks and night janitors instead of being chauffeured past them behind tinted glass. He never found an answer that satisfied him, only the quiet suspicion that somewhere along the way he had traded something essential for something merely expensive, and he had not yet figured out how to get it back. The city outside his tinted windows had always looked like a map of opportunities to him, glowing towers and quarterly earnings waiting to be unlocked, but from the seat of a late-night bus, it looked instead like a map of quiet endurance, thousands of small lives moving through darkness toward mornings that rarely rewarded them fairly for the effort. On the other side of the city, in a small apartment above a laundromat that hummed through the walls at all hours. A woman named Naomi Brooks was already living a life built entirely around exhaustion and quiet endurance. She was 35 years old, and she worked two jobs that together demanded more hours than most people would consider reasonable to give away in a single week of their lives. During the day, she cleaned office buildings downtown, moving silently through hallways long after the executives had gone home to their families, emptying trash cans and polishing floors that reflected lights she would never sit beneath as an employee of any company. At night, she took the bus across town to a hospital, where she worked as a support staff member, helping nurses, comforting frightened patients, and doing the invisible labor that keeps a hospital breathing steadily at 3 in the morning when everyone else is asleep. Naomi never complained, not once, not even when her feet ached so badly by the end of a shift that she had to sit on the curb outside the hospital just to catch her breath before walking to the bus stop. She was the kind of woman who noticed when a patient looked frightened in the dark and stayed an extra 5 minutes just to hold their hand, even though nobody would ever know or thank her for it afterward. She had learned early in life, from a mother who cleaned houses for 30 years without ever once being late, that dignity was not something other people handed to you, but something you carried yourself, quietly, into every room you entered, regardless of what that room asked of you. Coworkers often said she seemed to run on something other than sleep, though in truth she simply refused to let her circumstances turn her bitter or careless with the people around her. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that made people underestimate how tired she truly was, because she never let her exhaustion show in her voice, her posture, or the small smile she offered strangers out of habit. On the bus that night, after 16 straight hours split between two jobs and barely a meal in between, her body had finally given in, and she had drifted into a sleep so deep that the entire world around her simply disappeared. It was in that vulnerable, unguarded moment, stripped of the armor she wore during her waking hours, that a stranger named Ethan Carter first laid eyes on her. Naomi opened her eyes to the gentle pressure of a hand on her shoulder and the sudden sharp fear that she had missed her stop, a fear that lived permanently in the back of her mind after years of racing against schedules that left no room for mistakes or excuses. She apologized to the driver on reflex, gathering her bag and rising too quickly, her body still half caught between sleep and panic, and that was when the two pay stubs slipped from the loose flap of her bag and drifted to the floor of the bus. Ethan reached down before she could and handed them back to her, but not before his eyes had already caught the numbers printed neatly across the top of each slip. 92 hours in a single week, spread across two separate jobs, and a total income so small, after deductions for insurance, taxes, and a student loan payment, that it barely covered what he might spend on a single quiet dinner without giving it a second thought. Naomi's face flushed with something between embarrassment and quiet anger as she took the papers back and folded them tightly into her palm, pressing them against her chest for a moment as though shielding a wound. "I don't like people looking at those," she said, her voice steady, despite the tension underneath it, the kind of steadiness that came from years of protecting her pride in a world that rarely offered her any protection in return. Ethan apologized immediately, aware that he had crossed a line without meaning to, and he stepped back to give her space as the bus doors hissed open onto the wet street outside. Yet even as she walked away into the rain without looking back, something about her refused to leave his mind, not pity exactly, but a strange, sharp curiosity he had not felt in years of carefully guarded interactions. He kept thinking about the way she had said those words, not with shame, but with the fierce protectiveness of someone guarding the last scrap of control she had left over her own story. That single sentence would echo in his mind long after the bus had pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the dark. Neither of them expected to see each other again, and neither had exchanged so much as a name before parting ways that night. Yet the city has a curious way of drawing certain lives back into orbit around one another. 2 days later, Ethan happened to step off the same bus at the same stop, and there she was again, standing beneath the narrow awning of a closed shop as rain fell in heavy, relentless sheets around her. She had no umbrella that evening, only her jacket pulled up over her head in a poor imitation of shelter, and the water was already soaking through the fabric at her shoulders. Ethan approached and offered to share his umbrella, a small and simple gesture that in his old world would have been met with immediate acceptance, if not outright gratitude carefully designed to please a man of his stature and reputation. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as though trying to place it, then politely declined, saying she only had a short walk ahead and did not want to trouble a stranger over something so small. He offered again, more gently this time, and even suggested calling a car to take her home, so she would not have to walk through the storm at all, gesturing vaguely toward the phone in his coat pocket. "It's really no trouble," he said, aware, even as he spoke, that the words sounded exactly like something a man who had never once worried about trouble would say without thinking twice about the weight behind them. Naomi caught the irony in his voice before he did, and something close to amusement flickered briefly across her tired face, though she did not explain what she found so quietly funny about a stranger's insistence on rescuing her from a little rain. She shook her head, thanking him, but refusing just the same, explaining that she preferred to manage her own way home rather than depend on a stranger's convenience or charity. There was no anger in her refusal, no performance of independence for its own sake, only a calm and unshakable self-reliance that seemed to come from somewhere very deep inside her, forged over years of standing entirely on her own 2 feet. Ethan stood there in the rain, momentarily speechless, because it had been years, perhaps longer than he wanted to admit even to himself, since anyone had turned down something from him without calculating what they might gain by accepting it instead. Every offer he made in his ordinary life came wrapped in expectation. Every kindness he extended was quietly weighed against what people believed he could give them in return, a currency exchange disguised as generosity. Naomi Brooks did not know who he was, and stranger still, she did not seem to care in the slightest. She simply wanted to walk home in the rain and be left to do it in peace, without owing anyone anything for the privilege of a dry shoulder. That refusal, so small and so ordinary to her, struck Ethan with the force of something rare and unfamiliar, because for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was standing in front of a person who saw him only as a man on a bus, nothing more, and nothing less than that. He watched her disappear down the street, her shoulders hunched against the storm, and found himself standing under the awning long after she had gone, turning the moment over and over in his mind, like a coin he could not stop examining from every angle. Over the following weeks, Ethan began riding that same night bus more often than his schedule actually required, adjusting meetings and calls to make sure he could still catch it before midnight. More often than not, their paths crossed again in small, unplanned ways. A nod at the bus stop, a shared glance when the bus arrived late, a brief exchange about the weather, that neither of them treated as small talk. He learned her name eventually, simply by asking one evening when the bus was nearly empty, and once he had it, small pieces of her story began to surface in quiet conversations that never lasted more than a few minutes at a time. He discovered that Naomi had once graduated near the top of her class with a degree in business administration, a fact she mentioned almost in passing one night, as though it belonged to a different woman entirely, someone she used to know, rather than someone she had once been herself. She had worked in a mid-sized company's finance department for nearly 6 years, steadily building a career she was genuinely proud of, until an economic downturn swept through the industry and closed the doors of the company almost overnight without warning. She lost her position, along with hundreds of others, in a single round of layoffs, and what followed was a long, grinding search for work that never seemed to end in anything but polite rejection letters. Employers looked at the gap growing steadily on her resume and drew their own conclusions, assuming something was wrong with her, rather than wrong with an economy that had discarded so many qualified people at once, without ceremony. Months turned into a year, then longer, and the modest savings she had carefully built began to disappear into rent, groceries, and the slow, quiet erosion of hope she tried not to let anyone see. She sent out application after application, sat through interviews where she could feel the moment interest curdled into hesitation, and drove home each time, rehearsing what she might have said differently. Some nights she sat at her kitchen table with her old diploma propped against a coffee mug, staring at the honors seal stamped in gold, as though it might explain to her why none of it seemed to matter anymore to anyone reading her resume. Eventually, she stopped waiting for the career she had trained so hard for, and instead took whatever work she could find. First, cleaning offices at night, then picking up hospital shifts through a staffing agency that never once asked about her degree at all. When Ethan asked, gently, whether it bothered her to have fallen so far from where she once stood in her own eyes, Naomi simply shrugged and said that every job deserves respect because the people who do them are still human beings trying to survive with whatever dignity they can hold on to. It was a simple sentence, spoken without bitterness or self-pity, and it would come to define everything that happened between them from that point forward. Ethan could not stop thinking about her words, replaying them during meetings, hearing them in the quiet of his penthouse long after midnight. In the weeks that followed, he began to watch her more closely, though never in a way that felt intrusive or unwelcome to her, always from a respectful distance that asked nothing in return. He noticed, almost by accident, how she moved through the hospital corridors during her shifts, stopping to comfort patients who had no family present at their bedside, holding the trembling hand of an elderly man who was frightened of a procedure scheduled for the following morning. He saw her, on more than one occasion, quietly slip half of her own dinner into a paper bag and hand it to a homeless man who slept near the bus stop, never once mentioning it to anyone, never expecting a single word of thanks in return for the gesture. He watched her stop on her walk home to pick up litter that had blown across the sidewalk in the wind, not because anyone asked her to, but because it seemed to genuinely bother her to see the street left in disorder for someone else to deal with. Once he saw her give up her seat on a crowded bus to a pregnant stranger without a second of hesitation, standing the rest of the way home, even though her own legs were shaking with fatigue by then. Another night, he watched her stay nearly an hour past the end of her shift, sitting with a young mother whose child had been admitted alone, simply so the woman would not have to wait in that hallway by herself. None of it was performed for an audience, because there was no audience to perform for, no one recording, no one watching who might reward her with attention or praise. No cameras followed her through those long nights. No one praised her for the small kindnesses she scattered so freely. No one even noticed most of the time, and yet she continued doing these small, unremarkable acts of goodness night after night, as though it were simply woven into who she was as a person. Ethan began to understand something he had somehow forgotten during his years of building an empire brick by brick, that true generosity reveals itself most clearly in the moments when nobody is watching at all, when there is nothing whatsoever to be gained from being kind. He had spent so long surrounded by people who were kind to him only when it might be profitable to their own ambitions, that he had almost convinced himself real kindness no longer existed anywhere in the world he lived in. Watching Naomi move quietly through her exhausting days, giving away pieces of herself to strangers who would never know her name or think of her again, Ethan felt something shift deep inside him. A long-buried belief, slowly beginning to stir back to life after years of dormancy. It was this realization that finally pushed Ethan to make her an offer, though he approached it carefully, aware of how easily it could be misread as pity dressed up in professional language. He told her, without revealing his true identity, that he represented a private community fund searching for a program manager, someone honest and capable of overseeing resources meant to help working families across the city rebuild their lives. He said he needed someone who understood struggle firsthand, someone who would treat every dollar and every person involved with genuine care, rather than detached corporate efficiency. Naomi listened politely, her expression unreadable at first, but her posture hardened almost immediately, and she told him, with quiet firmness, that she did not need anyone's charity dressed up as an opportunity, meant to make him feel better about his own comfort. She had heard offers like that before, she said, offers that always seemed to come, with strings attached or expectations she was not prepared to meet, and she had learned to protect herself from disappointment by refusing them outright before they could hurt her. Ethan tried to explain that this was not pity, that he had watched her work with his own eyes and believed she was exactly the kind of person such a program truly needed, but Naomi remained unconvinced by his careful words. He tried a second time, days later, rephrasing the offer, softening it, even suggesting a trial period with no obligation attached, but she met each attempt with the same polite, immovable refusal. She thanked him for the offer and walked away, leaving him standing there once again, with the strange, unfamiliar feeling of having been refused by someone who owed him nothing and wanted nothing from him in return. A week later he tried once more, this time simply leaving the details of the position with a colleague who had no idea of his connection to her, hoping the offer might land differently, coming from a stranger with no history attached to it. Naomi read the letter twice at her kitchen table, turned it over in her hands, and set it aside without answering, telling herself she had survived perfectly well without anyone's rescue for years and did not need to start depending on one now. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself desperate, not for another business deal or another headline, but for the simple chance to prove to a stranger that his intentions were genuine and untainted. He realized, with a kind of quiet unease that followed him home that night, that everything in his life had trained him to buy trust, and none of it had prepared him for a woman who could not be bought at any price. Everything changed the night Naomi turned on the small television in her apartment and saw Ethan Carter's face fill the screen during a business segment about a major philanthropic announcement he had made earlier that week. She sat frozen on her second-hand couch, as the anchor described him as one of the wealthiest men in the country, a former technology founder turned quiet philanthropist, known for his reluctance to seek public attention or credit for his work. The man on the screen wore the same tired eyes and the same modest jacket she remembered from the bus, and slowly the pieces fell into place with a force that left her breathless and shaking slightly. He had not simply been a stranger who shared an umbrella and asked polite questions about her past over the course of several quiet evenings. He had been a billionaire the entire time, watching her, learning about her, all while she had no idea who she was truly speaking to during those small, unguarded conversations. Anger rose in her chest before she could stop it, hot and immediate, because it felt as though every small moment of honesty she had shared with him had been quietly observed and catalogued by someone with far more power than she could have ever imagined possessing. She thought of every conversation, every detail she had let slip about her old job, her degree, her struggles, and felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over her at the thought that he might have been studying her, like some kind of case study, in resilience for his own private curiosity. The next evening, she found the address of his offices downtown and went there directly after her shift ended, still in her hospital uniform, her exhaustion overtaken entirely by the force of her fury that had been building since the night before. She demanded to see him, and when he finally appeared in the lobby, she did not wait for pleasantries, before speaking her mind plainly and without hesitation. "I don't need to be saved," she said, her voice trembling with an anger that had clearly been building for hours inside her. "I have survived every single day of my life without a rescue from anyone, and I certainly don't need one from you, no matter how much money you have." Ethan stood quietly and let her finish before he spoke, choosing his words with more care than he had used in any boardroom negotiation of his entire career. "I wasn't trying to save you," he said, his voice low and steady, despite the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I wasn't trying to rescue you from anything, because you never needed rescuing in the first place, not for one single day. I offered you that position because I have met very few people in my life who I genuinely respect, and you are one of them, maybe the only one in a very long time. I just wanted the chance to work alongside someone whose integrity I actually believe in, someone who never once asked me for anything." The room fell silent for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over both of them like the rain that had first brought them together, and something in Naomi's expression began to soften, though her pride still held its ground beneath the surface. It was, without question, the most honest exchange either of them had experienced in years, stripped of every performance and every calculation, and it marked the true turning point of everything that followed between them from that night forward. In the weeks after that confrontation, Naomi finally agreed to accept the position, though she made it unmistakably clear that she would earn her place through results and nothing else, refusing any special treatment. Ethan placed her in charge of a new community initiative, designed to connect struggling workers with stable, well-paying employment, a project with real funding and real stakes attached to its success. Almost immediately, resistance appeared from within his own organization, as several senior directors questioned his decision in meetings held just out of Naomi's earshot, careful never to voice their doubts when she was present. They pointed to the years-long gap in her professional resume, whispered doubts about whether someone who had spent recent years cleaning offices could truly manage a multi-million-dollar initiative with any real competence. Some of the objections were dressed in careful, corporate language about qualifications and experience. But underneath the polished phrasing, it was clear that her background, her recent work as a laborer, and in some quiet, unspoken cases, even her race, were being weighed against her in ways no one dared say aloud in the open. Naomi heard the whispers eventually, as people in her position always do sooner or later, yet she chose not to waste her energy arguing with anyone who doubted her worth. Instead, she poured herself into the work with the same quiet determination she had once used to survive years of exhausting double shifts, treating every obstacle as simply another task to be handled, rather than a battle to be fought loudly with words. She built partnerships with local training centers, negotiated directly with small businesses willing to hire workers who had been overlooked by traditional hiring processes, and structured the program so that dignity, not charity, sat at its very center from the beginning. She insisted, against some early resistance, that every participant be treated as a candidate rather than a case file, that interviews happen with respect rather than suspicion, and that no one applying to the program ever be asked to explain or apologize for the gaps in their history, the way she herself had once been forced to over and over again, without mercy. She personally interviewed dozens of candidates herself, remembering what it felt like to be reduced to a gap on a piece of paper, and made sure every person who walked through her doors left feeling like more than a statistic on a spreadsheet somewhere. In one of the earliest board meetings, a senior director named Richard Hale suggested aloud that perhaps someone with a more traditional background should oversee the larger contracts, a comment that landed heavily in the silence that followed it. Naomi did not raise her voice. She simply laid out the placement numbers from the previous quarter, one column at a time, until the silence in the room changed from doubt into something closer to respect, and no one brought up the subject again in front of her. Within the first 6 months, the initiative had already placed hundreds of people into stable jobs, workers who had once been dismissed the exact same way she had once been dismissed herself years earlier. By the end of the first year, the numbers had grown so far beyond anyone's original projections that even her harshest critics inside the company found themselves with nothing left to say in the quarterly meetings. The program had by then placed workers in warehouses, hospitals, schools, and small family businesses across the city. Each placement tracked not just by wages earned, but by how many of them stayed in their new roles. Past the first difficult year, a number Naomi cared about more than any other metric on the report. It was during a quiet dinner months later, long after the doubts had faded, and the results spoke clearly for themselves in every report, that Ethan finally told her the full truth about the night they first met on that bus. He explained that, before boarding that bus, he had just walked out of a meeting where he intended to cancel a major humanitarian project he had spent years quietly building behind the scenes, convinced that his effort was pointless in a world that seemed to reward selfishness far more often than kindness. He admitted, with a rare vulnerability creeping into his voice, that he had begun to believe genuinely good people simply did not exist anymore, not in any meaningful, unrewarded way that mattered. Then he had seen her, asleep in the last row, arms wrapped protectively around a bag that held nothing more valuable than 2 modest pay stubs, and something about that simple image had stopped him cold in his tracks. He told her that in that single, unguarded moment, watching a woman who had nothing to gain from pretending to be anything other than exactly what she truly was, his faith in people had quietly begun to return to him, piece by piece. It was not Naomi who had needed saving that night, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper, but himself, and she had done it without even knowing his name or realizing the weight of what she carried. Naomi listened in silence, tears gathering at the edges of her eyes, as she finally understood the full weight of what that ordinary night on the bus had meant to a man whose life looked nothing like her own from the outside looking in. "I thought I was the one who needed help that night," she finally said, her voice barely steady. Ethan shook his head slowly. "We both did," he answered. "We just didn't know it yet." She reached across the table and, for the first time since they had met, let her hand rest over his, without hesitation, without calculation, without anything guarded left between them. Outside the restaurant window, the city continued its ordinary rhythm. Buses pulling away from curbs, people hurrying home beneath umbrellas, none of them aware that two lives at that small table had just quietly folded into one story instead of two separate ones. The truth reshaped everything between them, turning what had once felt like an act of charity from a wealthy stranger into something far more equal and far more meaningful. A story of two people who had unknowingly rescued each other from very different kinds of despair on the very same night. A year passed, and the community initiative Naomi had built from almost nothing grew into one of the most respected workforce programs in the entire city, eventually earning her the title of executive director over the newly established foundation, bearing her own careful fingerprints throughout its design. Under her leadership, thousands of working women received training in skills that opened doors previously closed to them for years, and thousands more men and women found stable employment through partnerships she had built with her own hands and her own relentless persistence. The organization opened a new community center downtown, a building filled with classrooms, counseling offices, and a job placement center designed to serve anyone willing to walk through its doors seeking a second chance at a different life. On the evening of its grand opening, hundreds of people gathered inside the newly finished building, many of them former participants of the very program that had once given them back their livelihoods and their sense of self-worth. Ethan stood at the podium that evening, dressed simply, without the polish and performance that once defined his public appearances during his years as a celebrated founder chasing headlines. He looked out over the crowd and spoke without notes, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly present beneath his measured words. "The person who changed my life was not a business partner, and she was not an investor," he said, pausing as the room grew quiet around him. Every face turned toward the stage. "She was a woman I found asleep on the very last bus of the night, holding onto two pay stubs as though they were the only proof she had that her hard work still mattered to someone in this world." A soft murmur moved through the crowd, and every eye in the room slowly turned toward Naomi, who stood near the front in a simple dress. Her expression caught somewhere between pride and quiet disbelief at hearing her own story spoken aloud, in front of so many strangers who had come to celebrate her work. Somewhere near the back of the room stood a young woman who had gone through the program only months earlier, now working as a dental assistant, wiping tears from her cheeks as she listened, because she recognized in that story the same exhaustion she herself had once carried onto buses just like that one. When the applause finally settled and the formal program came to its close, Naomi approached Ethan near the edge of the stage, reaching into her small handbag and withdrawing something carefully wrapped in a thin layer of plastic. It was the same two pay stubs from that night years earlier, now laminated and slightly worn at the edges from having been carried everywhere she went in the years since. "I kept these," she said quietly, holding them up so he could see them clearly, "so I would never forget where I started, no matter how far I managed to go from here." Ethan looked at the old papers, the same faded numbers he had once glanced at on a rainy bus so long ago, and felt the full circle of everything that had brought them to this exact moment together, in this exact room. They stood there for a long moment, no longer as a billionaire and the employee he had once tried carefully to help, but simply as two people who had found their way back to believing in something good, together and because of one another. Outside the community center, the city moved on as it always did, indifferent and unhurried, to the quiet miracles unfolding within its ordinary streets and buildings every single day. Yet somewhere across town, the same night bus continued its familiar route, rolling past the same darkened storefronts and rain-slicked corners it had passed 1,000 times before this one. On certain nights, Naomi still chose to ride it, not out of necessity anymore, since her life no longer demanded the exhausting double shifts that once defined her every waking hour, but because she wanted to remember where it had all begun. She would sit by the same window, watching the city lights blur past in the darkness, and let herself feel, just for a little while, the woman she used to be before everything around her changed so completely. More often than not now, at the very next stop after hers, Ethan would climb aboard as well, no longer a stranger, observing life from a careful, guarded distance, but a man who had finally found something worth sitting close to for the rest of his life. He would take the seat beside her, without a word needing to be spoken between them, and together they would ride in comfortable silence through streets that had once separated two entirely different worlds from one another. There were no grand declarations between them on those quiet rides, no promises shouted into the night for anyone to overhear, only the steady, unhurried comfort of two people who understood exactly what it had cost each of them to arrive at this particular moment together. Naomi kept the two laminated pay stubs in a small drawer by her bed now, no longer needing to carry them everywhere, because she no longer feared forgetting who she had been. Some mornings, before leaving for the center that now bore her careful signature on every program inside it, she would open that drawer just to look at them for a moment, not out of nostalgia for the exhaustion they represented, but out of gratitude for the woman who had carried that exhaustion without ever once letting it define her worth. Ethan, for his part, had stopped needing the anonymity of the night bus to feel human, though he never stopped riding it, because it was where he had finally remembered how. He had come to understand, slowly and without fanfare, that the wealth he once believed defined him had never been the thing that saved him at all, and that the truest fortune he had ever encountered rode the last bus home each night, tired hands folded around whatever little she had, refusing to let the world convince her it wasn't enough. It was a love built not on wealth or rescue, but on respect, earned slowly, honestly, and completely, forged somewhere between exhaustion and grace on the last bus of the night that neither of them would ever forget. And as the bus rolled onward through the sleeping city, carrying them both toward wherever the road led next, it seemed, for the first time in either of their lives, that home was not a place at all, but simply the person sitting quietly beside them in the dark, holding nothing back, and asking for nothing more than exactly this.